As the 19th century drew to a close, the US Navy had finally managed, in part courtesy to a Brazilian ironclad scaring some politicians, to actually get some funding from US Congress when they weren't actively at war with someone else. This had led to the creation of the first parts of what was termed the New Steel Navy, or the ABC Fleet, after the initial letters of some of the ships that were first built for it. And with these new capabilities had come somewhat more interest in what was actually going on outside the borders of the USA, at least where it concerned countries that had a bit more firepower than countries that were still in the feudal era, and therefore easy to order around, or else were very small islands that most people didn't even know existed. In particular, Central America and the Caribbean were still largely under the control of various European empires, but they were also right on the US's doorstep. Cuba, for example, was under Spanish control, but was going through a series of attempted liberation movements that had mostly developed into either a low-level civil war or a series of guerrilla attacks, depending on whose side of that particular equation you happen to be on. But Cuba also did a fair bit of trade with the United States, and much like the prelude to the US War of Independence over a century before, there was now a combination of economic disruption that was costing a lot of rich people money, and political disagreements with how remote European powers were handling matters relatively close to the US. When combined, together with some press coverage that was more about seeking headlines and sales of newspapers rather than pesky things like facts, the wheels of intervention began to turn. One of the classic ways that a 19th century power both expressed its concern and also tried to safeguard its economic interests and the citizens who were present in a particular area was to send a warship to that area to keep an eye on things. And thus, in January 1898, the armoured cruiser USS Maine showed up in Havana harbour. Armed with a pair of twin 10-inch turrets mounted en echelon along with a variety of smaller guns, the Maine had been one of the first new steel ships, along with the Battleship Texas. After almost a decade spent between its authorization and its actual commissioning, she'd only actually entered service a few years before this point, and thus she made quite a dominating presence in Central American waters. Some would refer to her as a battleship of some description, usually a second-class battleship as a result of her smaller guns, but semantics aside, with her peacetime white hull coloration, ochre superstructure, and black-painted guns, she certainly looked the part. In command was one Captain Charles D. Sigsbee, a 53-year-old veteran of the American Civil War with a passing interest in hydrography. As tension with Spain was rising, he suspected something might be done to his ship, and so, while Maine swung at her mooring, with most external visitors forbidden, other ships and boats were also forbidden to approach beyond a certain distance, and the Marines on board were told to keep a constant watch, along with having ready-use ammunition being laid out next to the ship's smaller guns. Elsewhere in the world, tensions had been escalating still more. On the other side of the Atlantic, the British shipbuilding industry was quite merrily working its way through not only a vast expansion program for the Royal Navy, but also a whole series of warship orders of varying sizes for around half a dozen different foreign navies at once, including Spain, who'd ordered some destroyers. But there were also rumours that Spain, in light of the tensions in Central America, was trying to acquire more ships, both in terms of new orders, but also in taking over ships that were being built for others who could no longer afford them, and these ships obviously would be available a lot sooner. Brazil, for example, had ordered 4 new protected cruisers a few years earlier. One of those, due to economic circumstances, had already been sold on the stocks to Chile, and while they were looking to take delivery of the second, the final 2 seemed to potentially be up for sale. And if they were, well, Spain was interested. In order to keep them out of the hands of Spain, the US Naval Attaché in the UK was now authorised to step in and buy them for the US Navy, if that was what was required to keep them out of Spanish hands. In the end, they would actually be bought into the US Navy and become the first New Orleans class. But back aboard Maine, her bunkers happened to contain two different kinds of coal. There was anthracite coal, the US Navy's historic default fuel as it was available in various coal fields in the eastern US, and bituminous coal, which had been loaded a couple of months earlier at Newport News. Now, although anthracite burned cleaner and was far more stable in storage, it was also somewhat expensive. The bituminous coal that was available in other US coal fields was cheaper, and at least in the case of the bituminous coal that was available in the US, per square foot of boiler grate, it burned somewhat hotter, thus granting more power. But it was also far less stable, and it was about as subtle as a brick to the face, giving off huge clouds of thick black smoke as well as sparks when it was burned, as opposed to anthracite, which, if burned correctly, gave off almost no visible smoke at all. The significant amount of secondary compounds in the bituminous coal also meant that the grates had to be cleaned more regularly, and then the ash had to be cleared out far more often as well. With an expanded fleet that was now almost entirely steam-driven, the US Navy, despite the disadvantages of it, was moving over to using the cheaper bituminous coal, almost entirely on a cost basis. But with a potential need for rapid action, Captain Sigsbee had held on to as much of this bituminous coal as humanly possible, since the anthracite coal allowed for a relatively easy journey to Havana and would mean minimal work to the boilers once they got there, while his stockpile of bituminous coal would be useful due to its higher power output to get the ship moving more quickly should something happen somewhere along the Cuban coast. Maine was originally scheduled to be back in the US in mid-February, but it was now feared that if she left, unless a similar or larger ship replaced her, any advantage the US might have gained in influence in the area from her presence would be lost. With the ship still standing apart from the locals, bar a few selected dinner guests, it was instead decided that other American civilian vessels who happened to be heading to and from Havana would be instructed to leave some of their supplies with the Maine to keep it on station, and the torpedo boat USS Cushing was also dispatched for a delivery run of military-specific items that Maine needed, but civilian ships generally didn't carry. Everything seemed to be working out roughly as planned, but then on the night of the 15th of February 1898, seemingly apropos of nothing, Maine's bow disappeared in a colossal explosion. The ship rapidly settled, with no less than 261 dead, most of them crewmen who'd been killed immediately by the explosion, or shortly thereafter by being pitched into the harbour in the middle of the night and then drowning. Only a few officers died, largely because enlisted accommodation was mostly up the front of the ship, which was where the explosion occurred, and most of the officers' quarters were right aft, which was about as far as from the explosion as one could be while still being on the ship. All told, fewer than 100 of the 355-strong crew survived, and with that loss of life, the situation began to spiral rapidly. The media blamed Spain for destroying the ship with a mine, and the whole thing was soon on the road to the Spanish-American War. But right from the start, some people wanted to know what had actually sunk the Maine. Back in the US, the Secretary of the Navy had observed that the split in opinion seemed to have more to do with people's political beliefs rather than facts. Those who wanted war insisted that Spain had blown up the ship, and this therefore was a cause to go to war. Those who didn't want conflict mostly said it was an accident, and therefore it wasn't a cause to go to war. Even one of Captain Sigsbee's early messages seemed to be hedging its bets, reading, "Probably the Maine destroyed by mine. Perhaps by accident. I surmise that her berth was planted previous to her arrival, perhaps long ago. I can only surmise this." Most naval officers seemed to side more with accident than sabotage. Frank F. Fletcher, for whom the World War II class of Fletcher-class destroyers was named, and who was also uncle to the future World War II Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, wrote at the time, "The disaster to the Maine is the one topic here now. Everybody is gradually settling down to the belief that the disaster was due to the position of the magazine next to the coal bunkers, in which there must have been spontaneous combustion. The US Navy's leading ordnance officer, Philip R. Alger, who at that point was serving at the Naval Academy, even went so far as to write a public letter to try and counter those who claimed the Spanish were responsible, with some indication that other senior officers were trying to push the Spain mine narrative, and he'd got fed up of being overlooked. He wrote, "As to the question of the cause of the Maine's explosion, we know that no torpedo such as is known to modern warfare can of itself cause an explosion of the character of that on board the Maine. We know of no instances where the explosion of a torpedo or mine under a ship's bottom has exploded the magazine within. It has simply torn a great hole in the side or bottom through which water entered, and in consequence of which the ship sunk. Magazine explosions, on the contrary, produce effects exactly similar to the effects of the explosion on board the Maine. When it comes to seeking the cause of the explosion of the Maine's magazine, we should naturally look not for the improbable or unusual causes, but those against which we have had to guard in the past. The most common of these is through fire in the bunkers. Many of our ships have been in danger various times from this cause, and not long ago a fire in the Cincinnati's bunkers actually set fire to fittings, wooden boxes, etc. within the magazine, and had it not been discovered at the time it would doubtless have resulted in a catastrophe on board that ship similar to the one on the Maine. I shall again emphasize the fact that no torpedo exploded without a ship has ever produced, or according to our knowledge can it produce, an explosion of a magazine within." He was generally right. Although almost 2 decades later the pre-dreadnought SMS Pommern would be blown up by a magazine explosion that did result from a torpedo strike, the torpedoes launched in World War I carried warheads that were typically 3 to 4 times as powerful as those that were available in the late 1890s, with little in the way of improved torpedo defense systems installed in the interim. And even after that particular sinking, much larger mine and torpedo warheads tended to allow water in fast enough to douse any fires that the initial explosion might have caused in various magazines. Now, expanding specifically on his mention of a fire aboard the USS Cincinnati, an examination of US Navy records for the years 1895, 1896, and 1897, plus the first month of 1898, show that in those years prior to the loss of the Maine, there had been no less than 3 coal bunker fires in the cruiser USS Olympia, 4 in the USS Wilmington. At least 1 each was recorded in the USS Petrel, Lancaster, and Indiana, and there were multiple fires aboard the armoured cruiser USS Brooklyn, although the exact number wasn't quantified, which is perhaps worrying in and of itself. The fire that was recorded aboard the Cincinnati, as well as another one aboard the USS New York, had almost caused the magazines to explode, as was partially related in the letter above. And USS Oregon had also reported that her magazines had been at risk from at least 1 coal bunker fire, although not quite to the immediate extent of the Cincinnati and the New York. In fact, 3 months prior to the loss of the Maine, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, one Theodore Roosevelt, had actually recommended a thorough investigation into the various types of coal and the causes of all this spontaneous combustion in the Navy. And at the time of the Maine's loss, he'd actually already put in place standing orders with American naval attachés to get information on the procedures that foreign navies were following to prevent spontaneous ignition of coal. So why, given this, was the Maine said to be sunk by a Spanish mine? There are several reasons. The political factions that wanted war, and the press, who wanted headlines, and war gave them the best headlines, were very vocal in pushing their mine idea. Some elements in the US Navy also adopted this stance because it was frankly the lesser of 2 undesirable choices. If the Maine had been lost to some kind of internal issue, then the ship's crew and captain was badly at fault, and possibly there was also an underlying problem with US Navy ships. Basically, they'd have to admit some significant internal failings within the Navy, and they didn't really want to. Conversely, If the Spanish were responsible, then there was potentially still some question about whether the crew had been negligent to not spot the deployment of the mine, but there were a couple of outs to that. The Spanish could have been really sneaky, or they could have just deployed the mine to the anchorage before the Maine even got there, as harbour mines in those days were controlled from stations ashore and thus could be activated and deactivated at will, assuming that the wires held. This, of course, would involve the blame falling squarely on somebody else who wasn't the US Navy. And then, of course, once war was declared, a few months later, not only was the loss of Maine a good rallying cry, but it would also be extremely embarrassing to then subsequently admit that you'd gone to war over a colossal misunderstanding. But in private, the US Navy rather rapidly convened a court of inquiry, as did the Spanish. The Americans, of course, had a much better idea of the structure and the operating procedures of the ship, while the Spanish, at least at first, had the more direct access to the wreck and obviously far more familiarity with the layout of the harbour. In those initial days, in the couple of months between the ship sinking and war being declared, there was even a degree of cooperation between the two sides. The preliminary Spanish investigation was wrapped up rather quickly, as they didn't have permission to dive on the wreck, or indeed divers to access the wreck at first. They were mostly limited to observations from boats and from swimmers on the surface, plus interviewing local witnesses and their own technical expertise in these matters. They concluded that the overall cause was probably some kind of internal explosion. This was based on the fact that they didn't know of any mines being placed in the area, and they couldn't find any evidence of that. Bearing in mind there was some talk about the fact that the dissidents might have planted a mine to try and get the US involved in the war, rather than the Spanish themselves. They also noted there were no schools of dead fish in the aftermath, which was the usual effect of an explosion in a relatively shallow harbour, as opposed to an explosion inside a ship where the expanding fireball, which was somewhat slower, as opposed to the initial shock wave, which was what occurred with a mine or a torpedo, would be what mostly propagated through the water. And what witnesses they could find reported seeing the ship explode, but no one reported seeing a column of water rise alongside the ship, as would be seen with some kind of external source, like a torpedo or mine, kicking it all off. The day after the Spanish officers sent off their preliminary report, a small flotilla of US craft arrived to begin examining the wreck for themselves. This included US Navy divers who were there to focus on what had actually happened to the ship, other commercial divers who were there under orders from the US Navy to salvage what they could, and by this stage, which was about a week after the ship went down, a few Spanish divers had also been found to assist. Unsurprisingly, these three groups sometimes got in each other's way. The inquiry heard testimony that said that proper procedures for looking after the magazines and the bunkers had been followed, and that the ship's torpedoes, which some thought might have been involved in some manner, were in fact not armed and therefore could not have been a cause. Divers picking through the remains of the bow quickly confirmed that one or both forward magazines had exploded, with more damage found to port than to starboard. Soon, a lot of examination and questions centred on the ship's keel, as just forward of the magazines, the keel had been driven up above the main deck level and twisted around. The question seemed to be if an internal explosion could do such a massively violent thing. Although there were theories presented which could account for the magazines alone exploding and thus causing this deformation, in the end, the court decided that the ship had been hit by two separate explosions. A mine, positioned underneath the ship's bow, which had kicked it upwards and caused the extreme bend of the keel, followed by a second explosion in the magazines, which had blown off the armoured and main decks and then bent them back over themselves. Crucially, though, the court was unable to say who was responsible for the mine. But they did reckon that a mine of considerable power had been exploded under the ship's bow, and they thought this was some distance forward of the magazines. The small detail of not actually assigning responsibility for the placement of the mine seemed to be lost as the nation spiralled off into war, and the blame for the Maine was placed primarily on Spain. But other experts were soon weighing in against the idea of a mine. Over in the UK, one Lieutenant Colonel Bucknell, who was an expert on mines and had carried out a number of practical experiments on older ships, argued in an article in a professional magazine that a mine that was large enough to do the kind of damage observed would have needed some time to prepare and a fairly large crew to install if it was being placed in the harbour. Given that the Spanish had had less than 24 hours' notice of Maine's imminent arrival and still less notice of which of the 4 large berths designed for warships that she was going to be moored on, and the fact that there were busy commercial wharves and a German Navy training ship less than a few hundred feet away, he argued that no installation of such a large device could possibly have gone unnoticed, and the idea of a drifting mine would, given the location of the explosion deep in or under the ship, almost certainly have snagged on the seabed well before it could reach the ship itself. He also pointed out that in his experience, mines detonated underneath ships tended to result in dishing in large portions of the hull, not a short, sharp upswing, which was what was seen with Maine's keel. Instead, he argued that a coal bunker fire had set off the 6-inch magazine adjacent to it, which in turn had set off a good part of the 10-inch magazine. And when this had detonated, it had lifted all the decks while driving the lower part of the ship down. Since the bow hadn't been immediately severed from the ship completely, this would have caused the keel forward of the blast to be lifted up by the upper portions of the ship, which were being blown upwards, dragging it upwards, while the downward blast ensured that there was a weak point for it to bend around. The bow then mostly detaching and sinking rather rapidly nose first, combined with the rest of the ship being shoved forward by the water to fill the void that had been left by the explosion, would have completed a concertina and left the keel bent as found. He pointed out that the slow-burning black powder of the 10-inch gun charges would have produced a great deal of sustained force, at least as far as explosions are concerned, as compared to some of the latest smokeless powders, which would deliver a somewhat different effect in the form of a far more rapid, shattering explosion. But things would rumble on until 1910. By this stage, the Spanish-American War was long over, Cuba was independent, and the wreck of the Maine was occupying some rather valuable harbour space. And so Congress voted funds to salvage the wreck, recover as many of the bodies that were still inside as possible, as well as examine the wreck a bit more closely, and then sink it again in deeper water where it wouldn't bother anyone. With the chance to examine the wreck more thoroughly, and without a question of war hanging over them, a new investigation board was thus convened. The plan was to build a cofferdam around the wreck, drain the interior, examine it, cut away the most damaged bits for separate salvage, and then make the bulk of the ship watertight again so that it could be refloated. This work began in late spring and early summer 1911, but as the operation went on, it seemed to become a race against time. The rear half of the ship was of course in the best shape for refloating, but once all the water had been pumped out of the cofferdam, it was found that the cofferdam was under huge external pressure and would apparently need bracing very soon. That bracing was initially projected to run right through the area of the mangled bow, which would require its rapid removal, and so inspections would need to be completed before the cofferdam gave way and flooded everything. To save on time, much of the investigation was therefore to be done by means of taking as many detailed photos as possible for later examination. Although, as it turned out, the US Army engineers managed to brace the cofferdam successfully without affecting the bow after a bit of clever thinking, which meant that they ended up with a lot of photos and an extension to their time to physically examine the ship. All of this led to the Vreeland Board, named after the Admiral who oversaw it. By 1912, the bulk of the wreck had been refloated, taken out to sea and sunk once again, with some of the heavier items of wreckage remaining in place embedded and then covered by the mud. The new report found that the damage to the ship was actually much worse than the 1898 board had thought, which was understandable given they'd been operating in very limited visibility. Interestingly, though, they agreed with Lieutenant Colonel Bucknell in that the keel bend just forward of the magazines had in fact been caused by the explosion of the forward main magazine and not a mine. That said, They still concluded that the prime culprit of the whole incident was some kind of mine, just a much smaller one placed in a much different area, considerably further aft, where they said there was evidence of an external force displacing about 100 square feet of hull plating inwards, whereas most of the hull plating had been displaced outwards. This inwardly displaced plating, they believed, was evidence of a mine which had set off the 6-inch magazine, which had then set off the 10-inch magazine. Back across the Atlantic, Bucknell was still sceptical of this new mine theory, as he noted that internal explosions and the subsequent deformation of the ship could buckle plates both in and out, and the proposed position of the mine, right at the aft end of the 6-inch magazines and to the port side, should have resulted in far more damage to the forward machinery spaces, which were almost adjacent to where the magazine would have begun to explode, as compared to the bent and buckled keel, which was about 10 to 15 frames further forward. Still, the official narrative of some kind of mine stuck for the next 6 decades or so, until, in the 1970s, Admiral Rickover, who by this point had stuck a nuclear reactor in almost everything he was ever likely to be able to get permission to do, decided to take another look at the sinking himself, along with a rather considerable battery of other experts. Although the wreck was now in no way able to yield new results, the sheer number of high-quality photos taken in 1911, along with documents and other descriptions, allowed for an investigation utilizing far more advanced techniques of naval architecture that were now available to him. I will now read from part of the report, the bit that concerns the evaluation of the wreck itself. Comments on the evidence. There were 3 separate examinations of the wreckage, one performed in connection with the 1898 US Court of Inquiry, a second performed by Spanish divers, also in 1898, and a third performed in connection with the 1911 Board of Inspection and Survey. The description of the wreckage contained in the 1898 Court of Inquiry report was obtained basically from diver inspections in muddy water. The Spanish divers who investigated the wreck in 1898 were even more handicapped because the Spanish knew less about the ship. Between 1898 and 1911, and the dewatering, various salvage operations were carried out. These may have disturbed minor elements of the wreck, and the 13 years of immersion allowed powder to dissolve, steel to rust, and wood to rot, but the essential pieces of the wreck remained. The 1911 inspection was made by open-air surveys of the wreckage after it had been dewatered inside a cofferdam. This permitted accurate identification of almost every bit of wreckage, measurement of displacements, and photographic recording. Therefore, despite the time lapse between the explosion and the 1911 inspection, our study of the wreckage has been based on the 1911 data. The statements in the 1911 report describing the wreckage and the photographs and sketches of the wreckage are generally consistent with one another. The photographs were taken as the dewatering progressed and the wreckage was dismantled. In some cases, wreckage material was removed in the interval between pictures. This was taken into account in the interpretation of the photographs. Evidence of a magazine explosion. The general character of the overall wrecked structure of the Maine, with hull sides and hull deck structures peeled back, leaves no doubt that a large internal explosion occurred. This is the immediate reaction on seeing the photographs of the wreckage. The impression is verified by the similarities to some later experience. In a recent study of warhead effectiveness, high explosive charges were fired inside destroyer hulks. Allowing for the differences in explosive type, size, and placement, the damage produced was remarkably similar to that found on the Maine. The internal explosion on the Maine was, without a doubt, a magazine explosion, since only the magazines contained an amount of explosive material sufficient to do the documented damage. The wreckage also leaves no doubt that the explosion was in the forward magazines, since the aft magazines were found intact in the less damaged aft portion of the ship. Magnitude and location of magazine explosion. It is quite clear that the full contents of all the forward magazines did not explode. This is proven by the fact that unexploded debris of 1-pounder, 6-pounder, 6-inch and 10-inch ammunition was found widely scattered within and outside the wreck. The evidence was therefore examined to determine what quantities of powder did explode and to determine the area in which the explosion was centered. This is the area we must examine to find clues for the initiating cause. The location of the center of the explosion can be determined from the structural damage to the main, as follows. The direction and manner in which the upper decks were peeled back indicates that the center of the explosion was in the aft part of the forward magazine complex. Further, the longitudinal bulkhead between the 10-inch magazine, A13-M, and the coal bunker, A15, on the starboard side, was still attached to the inner bottom, and part of bulkhead 21 between the forward fixed ammunition room, A9M, and the forward 6-inch magazine, A6M, was still attached to the starboard side of the hull. Similar bulkheads on the port side were completely swept away, indicating that the explosion forces were greater on the port side than on the starboard side. Finally, the damage to the inner bottom was most severe in the region under the 6-inch reserve magazine, A14M, which was on the port side around frame 27. Thus, the 1911 conclusion that the center of the explosion was in the 6-inch reserve magazine is sustained by the existing evidence. The structural damage details also contain some evidence bearing on the amount of powder that probably exploded. Interpretation of this evidence is made possible on the basis of World War II experience with bomb explosions inside ships of light construction similar to the Maine. The extent of damage caused by the bombs has been related to the amount and type of explosive contained in them. Looking for the extent of similar interior blast damage on the Maine, we find that such damage reached aft to frame 54 but not beyond. Forward of the explosion center, located around frame 27, the interior blast damage reached to the end of the bow. From this, it is estimated that 10 to 20,000 pounds of powder exploded. The estimate takes into consideration that the Maine's magazines contained brown prismatic powder rather than high explosive used in the bombs of World War II. It is assumed that black or brown gunpowder is about 2/3 as effective in causing structural damage as the same weight of TNT. The powder content of the forward magazines is estimated to have been, in the 6-inch reserve magazine A14-M, 11,190 pounds. In the forward fixed ammunition room A9-M, just over 6,700 pounds. In the forward 10-inch shell room A12-M, 2,498 pounds. In the forward 10-inch magazine, A13-M, 39,500 pounds. And in the forward 6-inch magazine, A6-M, 12,262 pounds, for a total of just over 72,000 pounds. With the evidence indicating that the explosion was centered on the 6-inch reserve magazine, A14-M, and that 10 to 20,000 pounds of powder exploded, we can conclude that most of the 11,190 pounds in the 6-inch reserve magazine, A14-M, exploded, possibly together with parts of the contents of adjacent magazines. With relation to bottom damage below the explosion center, the 1911 board stated its conclusion as follows. The board finds that the injuries to the bottom of the Maine above described were caused by the explosion of a charge of low form of explosives exterior to the ship between frames 28 and 31, strake B on the port side. This resulted in igniting and exploding the contents of the 6-inch reserve magazine, A14-M, said contents including a large quantity of black powder. The more or less complete explosion of the contents of the remaining forward magazines followed, the magazine explosions resulting in the destruction of the vessel. This finding was based almost entirely on the appearance of the wrecked bottom structure on the port side located approximately between frames 22 and 33. Using the frames and the strakes, the longitudinal rows of bottom plating as references, the 1911 board identified 4 damaged sections of the bottom. The board reported that the bottom section 1 was displaced inward, whereas the adjacent sections 2 were displaced outward. The inward displacement of section 1 was taken by the board as proof of its conclusions quoted above. We do not believe this conclusion can be drawn from the evidence. In fact, it appears more appropriate to conclude from the total evidence that there was no external burst. The arguments for this are as follows. All of the bottom structure in this area was deflected downward, except A, the section 1 piece of outer bottom plating around strakes B and C that was folded inward over the severely crumbled inner bottom, and B, the adjacent edge of the port garboard strake, strake A, which was bent inward slightly. The inward folded section 1 plating was bent smoothly, not severely mangled, and shows no evidence of the rupture or deformation typical of an external contact or near-contact explosion. The Spanish contact mines of the day contained a charge of 100 to 200 pounds of gun cotton. Such a charge would have ruptured and mangled the outer bottom over an area of 15 to 25 feet in diameter, and would most likely have ruptured the keel had it exploded at or near the B strake. The location of the charge would have been necessary if the 6-inch magazine was to be ignited by the burst. The keel was not broken in that area, and the outer bottom plating does not exhibit the mangling expected from an outside burst. It also appears that the inner bottom plating was more mangled than the outer bottom plating in this region, which is again contrary to expectations if an external burst had taken place. If an external burst did not take place in the vicinity of frame 30, the inboard folding of section 1's portion of the bottom plating in that area must be accounted for in some other way. A simple explanation is not to be found. However, some possible ways in which it could have occurred are as follows. The 6-inch reserve magazine was bounded by transverse bulkheads at frames 24 and 30, and by two longitudinal bulkheads, of which the inboard one was directly over the B strake. There was also a longitudinal web between the inner and outer bottom plating at the B strake. When the magazine exploded, both bottom platings and bulkheads were ruptured. It appears plausible that the inner bottom around the boundaries of the section 1 plating could have ruptured prior to the bulkheads. Then, when the bulkheads were displaced violently an instant later, the attached pieces of the bottom structure were whipped upward. In the process, the inner bottom plating became folded up and the longitudinal web was torn loose and was also whipped up. Another phenomenon which might have contributed to the final position of the section 1 bottom plating is the following. The ruptures in the bottom would have permitted some of the high-pressure explosive gases from the magazine to expand into the bottom structure, pushing it sideways, and also below the ship, pushing the water aside. The subsequent return rush of the water and the rapid flooding into the ship could have caused the unstiffened, unsupported outer bottom plating to then be bent inward to its final position. The inward bending of the edge of the port garboard strake, strake A, of bottom plating can be explained as follows. Before the explosion, the edge of strake A was riveted to the bottom of section 1. When section 1 was whipped upward by either of the above described mechanisms, the edge of strake A was carried along until the rivets failed. Another effect which could have contributed to the inward bending of both section 1 and strake A was the force of hitting the harbour bottom when the ship sank immediately after the explosion. Although these explanations of the condition of the plate are conjectural, an occurrence such as the inward folding of section 1 is not unique in the field of structural response to explosive loads. The overall weight of the evidence obtainable from the damaged bottom of the Maine points towards the absence of an external burst. Damage to the keel and bow. The 1898 Court of Inquiry concluded that the Maine explosion was initiated by a mine below the ship in the area near frame 18. The principal evidence advanced to support this was the appearance of the keel in the region of frames 18 to 22 and the position of the bow section as these were revealed by diver inspections. The keel was bent into an inverted V shape, with the top of the V above water, and the bow section was turned to port and capsized on its starboard side. These displacements were thought to have been due to an external burst below the keel near frame 18. The location is below the forward 6-inch magazine A6M. After the wreck was dewatered, the 1911 board concluded the explosion was not centred at frame 18 but in the 6-inch reserve magazine A14M near frame 27, and that it was initiated by an external burst below that location. As indicated in the previous sections, our examination of the evidence confirms this location of the explosion centre, but not that the explosion was initiated by an external burst. Thus, the evidence in no way, shape or form supports the 1898 conclusion. The V-shape of the keel and the capsizing of the forward section were secondary results of the magazine explosion that have no bearing on whether there was an external burst. They are, nevertheless, on the surface, rather surprising phenomena. To complete our discussion of the wreckage evidence, the following explanation is advanced for the positions of the keel and bow. The explosion destroyed the hull girder by removing the sides, rupturing the decks, and decreasing the spacing between the inner and outer bottoms. The forward section was separated from the aft section, except where the two were connected by the keel and the adjacent bottom plating, mostly on the starboard side. The protective deck was broken at frame 24 by the explosion. Most of the forward portions of this deck were folded upward and forward over the bow, carrying portions of the berth, main and superstructure decks along with them. Another phase of the destruction then followed as a result of the sinking motions of the forward and aft sections. The repositioning of the protective deck and other weights made the forward section extremely unstable, and it capsized onto its starboard side. Although the remaining bottom structure connecting the forward and aft sections did contain some unbroken structural members, they alone were not strong enough, without the support of the ship's sides and decks, to resist the bending and twisting exerted by the capsizing forward section of the ship. Because of the shape of the remaining portion of the forward section and its top-heavy condition, the aft end of the keel of the forward section at about frame 17 was raised well above its normal position. This bent the keel and the attached bottom plating into the vertical position between frames 21 and 17, as noted in both the 1898 and 1911 investigations. The aft section of the hull was flooded through the hole so that the intact aft section of the ship inclined down at its forward end. Since the bottom structure connecting the forward and aft sections was probably already on the bottom of the harbour at frame 21, the continued sinking of the aft section bent the keel and bottom in the vicinity of frame 35 by pressing the bottom of the ship between frames 35 and 21 against the harbour bottom, or by hanging it from the capsized forward section at frame 17.9. The precise sequence of events that occurred cannot be established without experiment or further study, but it seems clear that the general mechanism explaining the final gross condition of the forward section of the wreck does not involve an explosion external to the hull. So, overall, what did happen? Almost certainly a fire in bunker A16. Fires of this kind had happened before, as we've seen, and had actually happened fairly regularly in the years leading up to the destruction of the Maine, even to the point of threatening the magazines of a ship, even during the daytime when there were significantly more men around. This explosion happened at night when much fewer men would have been around inspecting the bunkers and the magazines. Fires in coal bunkers like this, especially with this kind of coal, were difficult to detect at first. They could smoulder quite deep below the exposed surface of coal, and, insulated by said coal, they could raise the temperature in their local vicinity without raising the temperature external to the coal pile enough to set off a heat alarm. The bunker on the Maine had not been inspected for about 12 hours prior to the explosion, although this was in keeping with scheduled inspections. But that was a long enough period in which other coal bunker fires would show there was enough time for a bunker fire to begin, to heat the intervening bulkheads, and then to set fire to the contents of adjacent compartments like the reserve 6-inch magazine. In short, Maine was just unlucky.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.